Picture this. You're standing on a military firing range, surrounded by seasoned soldiers who've already decided you don't belong. The drill sergeant walks up with a rifle that's clearly seen better days, scratched, dented, with a stock held together by electrical tape. He drops it in your hands with a smirk and says, "Good luck with that one, rookie." What would you do? Most people would accept defeat before they even pulled the trigger. But this isn't a story about most people. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Maria Rodriguez, a 19-year-old from East Los Angeles who enlisted in the Army in 1987, during a time when female soldiers faced challenges that would make today's barriers seem insignificant. Maria grew up in a neighborhood where gunshots weren't uncommon, but they weren't celebratory. They were reminders of a reality she desperately wanted to escape. Her father worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, and her mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in Beverly Hills, coming home each night with stories of a life that seemed impossibly distant. When Maria announced she was joining the military, the reactions in her community were mixed. Some saw it as an escape route, a chance at education and stability. Others viewed it as abandonment. Why leave the barrio to serve a country that had given them so little? But Maria had made up her mind. She'd watched too many of her friends get caught up in the cycle of poverty and violence that seemed to grip her neighborhood like a vice. The military represented something different: discipline, purpose, and the chance to prove that a girl from East LA could excel in any arena. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri was a culture shock that went beyond anything Maria had imagined. The rural Missouri landscape was alien to someone who'd grown up surrounded by concrete and palm trees. But the real challenge wasn't the environment, it was the attitude of her fellow recruits and some of the instructors. In 1987, women made up less than 10% of the Army, and many of the men made it clear they believed that percentage was still too high. Maria's drill sergeant, Staff Sergeant Thompson, was old-school military, a Vietnam veteran who'd come up through the ranks when the Army was an all-male institution. He wasn't necessarily malicious, but he subscribed to the belief that combat roles required a certain kind of toughness that he didn't think women possessed. From day one, he made Maria's life more difficult than necessary, assigning her extra duties, scrutinizing her performance with a microscope, and making comments that would have resulted in disciplinary action in today's Army. But Maria had grown up tough. She'd learned to fight her own battles on the playground when kids made fun of her secondhand clothes. She'd stood up to older boys who thought her younger brother was an easy target. She'd worked part-time jobs since she was 14 to help her family make ends meet. Staff Sergeant Thompson's psychological warfare was nothing compared to what life had already thrown at her. The first few weeks of basic training focused on physical conditioning, military protocol, and classroom instruction. Maria excelled in most areas. She was naturally athletic, had a sharp mind for tactics and regulations, and possessed an inner drive that impressed even her harshest critics. But there was one area where she truly shined: marksmanship. Growing up in East LA, Maria had never held a real firearm. Her only experience with weapons came from the occasional BB gun at a carnival or the plastic water guns she'd played with as a child. But something clicked the first time she picked up an M16 during weapons familiarization. The instructor demonstrated proper standing stance, breathing techniques, and sight alignment, and Maria absorbed every word like her life depended on it, which, in a way, it did. During the preliminary marksmanship training, Maria consistently outperformed most of her male counterparts. Her shots grouped tightly, her form was textbook perfect, and she had an intuitive understanding of how to adjust for wind and distance that usually took months to develop. The other recruits began to take notice, and so did Staff Sergeant Thompson. Instead of praise, Maria's exceptional performance seemed to irritate Thompson even more. He began making comments about beginner's luck and suggesting that the controlled environment of basic training didn't reflect real-world conditions. He seemed determined to find Maria's breaking point, to prove that underneath her composed exterior was just another scared girl who didn't belong in his army. The tension came to a head during the 8th week of training, just before the official qualification shoot that would determine whether recruits earned their expert marksman badge. This wasn't just about bragging rights. Marksmanship scores affected military occupational specialty assignments, and Maria had her sights set on becoming a military police officer, a role that required excellent shooting skills. The night before qualification, Maria lay in her bunk listening to the nervous chatter of her fellow recruits. Some had been practicing for weeks and were still struggling to hit the broadside of a barn. Others were natural shots, but cracked under pressure. Maria felt confident in her abilities, but she also knew that Staff Sergeant Thompson would be watching her every move, looking for any excuse to knock her down a peg. She had no way of knowing that Thompson had already decided to teach her a lesson she'd never forget. The morning of qualification dawned crisp and clear at Fort Leonard Wood. The Missouri air carried that particular bite of early autumn, and Maria could see her breath as she joined the formation outside the barracks at 0500 hours. Staff Sergeant Thompson was already there, clipboard in hand, wearing the expression of a man who'd been up since well before dawn planning something. "Listen up, recruits." Thompson's voice cut through the morning stillness like a blade. "Today separates the shooters from the prayers. Some of you will earn your expert badge and move on to advanced training with your heads held high. Others will barely qualify and spend the rest of their careers explaining why they can't hit what they're aiming at." His eyes swept over the formation, lingering on Maria with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. She'd learned to read Thompson's moods over the past 2 months, and something about his demeanor this morning felt different, more predatory than usual. The recruits marched to the firing range in the pre-dawn darkness, their breath creating small clouds that dissipated quickly in the cool air. Maria's mind was focused and clear. She'd spent the previous evening going through her pre-shot routine mentally, visualizing each stage of fire, each target engagement. She knew she was ready. The qualification course consisted of multiple stages: prone supported, prone unsupported, kneeling and standing positions at distances ranging from 50 to 300 meters. Recruits needed to score at least 23 out of 40 possible points to qualify, with 36 to 40 points earning the coveted expert marksman badge. Maria had been consistently shooting in the high 30s during practice sessions. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the range safety officer began his briefing. The familiar cadence of range commands and safety protocols washed over the recruits, words they'd heard hundreds of times, but never grew tired of because they meant the difference between life and death in real combat situations. "Weapons, draw," came the command, and the recruits filed toward the armory window to receive their assigned rifles. Maria watched as her classmates picked up their M16A1 service rifles, weapons that had been cleaned, maintained, and zeroed just hours before. Each rifle had been assigned a number, and each recruit had been shooting the same numbered weapon throughout their training to ensure consistency. When Maria's turn came, Staff Sergeant Thompson personally handed her a rifle. But this wasn't the pristine weapon she'd been expecting. The M16 in her hands looked like it had been through a war, which, as she would later learn, it literally had. The rifle's black finish was scratched and worn down to bare metal in several places. The handguards were cracked, held in place with green electrical tape that had seen better days. The stock wobbled slightly when she shouldered it, suggesting loose pins or worn connections. Most concerning of all, when Maria pulled the charging handle to check the chamber, it felt gritty and stiff, as if sand had worked its way into the mechanism. "Something wrong with your weapon, Rodriguez?" Thompson asked, his voice carrying just loud enough for the recruits nearby to hear. Several of them turned to look, and Maria could see the mixture of sympathy and relief in their eyes. Sympathy for her situation, relief that it wasn't happening to them. Maria examined the rifle more closely. The barrel crown, critical for accuracy, showed signs of damage. The front sight post appeared to be knocked off center. Even the sling swivels were bent and corroded. This wasn't just a well-used weapon, it was a rifle that should have been retired from service years ago. "No, drill sergeant," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. She understood exactly what was happening. Thompson was trying to sabotage her performance, to prove his point about women in the military by ensuring she failed with inferior equipment. "Good," Thompson smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm sure a soldier of your caliber can adapt to any weapon system. Isn't that right, Rodriguez?" The challenge was clear, and so was the trap. If Maria complained about the weapon, she'd be seen as making excuses before she even started shooting. If she accepted it without protest, she'd be stuck with equipment that would make qualifying difficult and earning expert virtually impossible. But Thompson had underestimated something crucial about Maria Rodriguez. Growing up in East LA had taught her that life rarely gave you the tools you needed to succeed. Sometimes you had to make do with what you had, and sometimes making do meant finding a way to excel despite the obstacles. "Yes, drill sergeant," Maria replied, slinging the battered rifle across her shoulder. "I can work with this." Thompson's smile widened. He'd expected resistance, argument, maybe even tears. Maria's calm acceptance of the situation seemed to catch him off guard, but only for a moment. "Outstanding attitude, recruit. I'm sure you'll do just fine." As the recruits moved to their assigned firing positions, Maria's classmates shot her looks of sympathy and whispered encouragement. Word was already spreading about the obviously sabotaged weapon she'd been given. Some of the more outspoken recruits were muttering about the unfairness of the situation, but Maria waved them off. She had work to do. At her firing position, Maria began her equipment check with the methodical precision she'd learned over the past 2 months. She adjusted the sling for proper support, checked the sight settings, and cycled the action several times to get a feel for the weapon's particular quirks. The bolt felt rough and the trigger pull was heavier than she was used to, but these were just variables to account for, not outright insurmountable obstacles. Thompson positioned himself directly behind Maria's firing point, ostensibly to observe her technique, but really to maximize the psychological pressure. Other drill sergeants spread out along the firing line, but Thompson had made it clear that Rodriguez was his special project for the day. The range went hot at exactly 0800 hours. 40 recruits lay prone on the firing line, each focused on the targets that would determine their military occupational specialty and, in many cases, the trajectory of their entire military careers. The morning air was still and clear, perfect conditions for accurate shooting. Maria settled into her prone position behind the battered M16, her body forming the stable platform she'd practiced thousands of times over the past 2 months. The electrical tape on the handguards felt rough against her hands, and she could feel the slight wobble in the stock as she pulled the rifle tight into her shoulder. But her breathing was controlled, her mind focused. "Shooters, you have unlimited time for your first 10 rounds. Prone supported position, 300 meters. Announced the range officer over the public address system. "Commence firing when ready." The crack of rifle fire began immediately as the more anxious recruits rushed their first shots. Maria knew better. She'd learned from her father, who'd worked construction for 20 years, that taking time to set up properly always paid off in the end. Rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes led to failure. She aligned her sights on the 300-meter target, a man-sized silhouette that seemed impossibly small at that distance. The front sight post appeared crooked, probably damaged from years of rough handling, but Maria made a mental note of the offset and adjusted her aim accordingly. Her first shot broke clean and true. Staff Sergeant Thompson stood directly behind her, close enough that she could smell his coffee breath and hear the subtle sounds of disapproval he was making. He was trying to get inside her head, to break her concentration with his presence. It was a tactic she'd seen him use on other recruits throughout training. But Thompson didn't understand something fundamental about Maria's background. Growing up in East LA meant learning to concentrate despite chaos. She'd done homework while her neighbors played music loud enough to rattle windows. She'd studied for tests while her little brother watched cartoons at maximum volume. She'd learned to find her own zone of focus in the middle of urban mayhem. A drill sergeant breathing down her neck was nothing. Her second shot followed the first, then her third. Each report of the rifle felt different from the pristine weapons she'd trained with, rougher, with more felt recoil due to the loose stock, but Maria adapted her hold and technique with each round. She was reading the weapon, learning its personality, making it work for her instead of against her. "Target," came the call from the 300-meter line. The pit crew would score each target and send up a signal to indicate where the shot hit. Maria's first target came up marked with a bullseye, a dead center hit worth 5 points, the maximum possible. She could hear Thompson shift behind her, probably surprised by the result. Around her, other recruits were getting target indications ranging from complete misses to decent hits in the outer rings. But Maria's target showed another bullseye. By the time she'd fired all 10 rounds at 300 meters, Maria had scored a perfect 50 points, 10 bullseyes in a row. The recruit firing next to her, a cocky kid from Texas who'd been bragging about his hunting experience since day one, had managed only 32 points with a weapon in perfect condition. "Lucky win conditions," Thompson muttered, loud enough for Maria to hear. "Let's see how you do when things get interesting." The 200-meter stage was fired from the prone, unsupported position, more challenging because the shooter couldn't use a sandbag or bipod for stability. Maria adjusted her position, wrapping her left arm through the sling to create bone-supported stability, and settled in behind the sights. The damaged front sight post was more noticeable at this distance, requiring her to cant the rifle slightly to compensate for its bent condition. It was an unorthodox technique that would have earned criticism in training, but this wasn't training anymore. This was about results. Her first shot at 200 meters was another bullseye. So was her second. By her fifth shot, a small crowd of drill sergeants had gathered behind her position, watching in amazement as she continued to punch perfect holes in the center of the target with a weapon that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Shooter on position 23 is running a perfect score," she heard one of them whisper to Thompson. "That can't be right with that piece of junk you gave her." Thompson's response was inaudible, but his body language spoke volumes. His plan to humiliate Maria was backfiring spectacularly, and everyone on the range was starting to notice. The 100-meter stage required shooting from the kneeling position, traditionally the most difficult for new shooters because it provided less stability than prone, but required more precision than standing. Maria had struggled with this position early in training, but countless hours of practice had paid off. She dropped into a solid kneeling position, her left elbow resting on her left knee, the sling wrapped around her support arm. The battered rifle felt familiar now, its quirks and imperfections mapped in her muscle memory. She knew exactly how much to compensate for the bent sight, exactly how much extra pressure the heavy trigger required. Her first shot at 100 meters, bullseye. Her second, bullseye. The pattern continued through all 10 rounds. By now, word was spreading throughout the range that something extraordinary was happening on position 23. Recruits from other firing orders were craning their necks to get a look at the girl with the broken rifle who was shooting a perfect score. The range officers had stopped their normal routine to watch, and even the gruff range master had emerged from his booth to observe. Maria was aware of the attention, but refused to let it break her focus. She had one more stage to complete. 10 rounds from the standing position at 50 meters. It should have been the easiest stage, but standing position was notoriously unpredictable, and she was shooting with equipment that had no business being on a qualification range. As she prepared for her final 10 shots, Maria caught a glimpse of Thompson's face. The smug confidence was replaced by something approaching panic. His plan to prove that women didn't belong in his army was about to become a demonstration of exactly the opposite.
The standing position at 50 meters should have been Maria's victory lap. After 30 perfect shots, she needed only a modest performance to secure not just qualification, but the expert marksman badge that had been her goal from day one. But standing unsupported, with no rest or stability aid, even experienced marksmen sometimes struggled to maintain the precision they'd shown from more stable positions. Maria rose from her kneeling position and took a deep breath. Her legs felt solid beneath her, her arms steady despite having held various shooting positions for over an hour. The physical conditioning from the past 2 months of basic training had prepared her body for this moment, but it was her mind that would determine whether she could finish what she'd started. She assumed the standing position she'd practiced thousands of times. Feet shoulder-width apart, body angled slightly toward the target, rifle butt firmly seated in the pocket of her shoulder. The broken weapon felt different standing up. The loose stock was more noticeable, the bent sight more challenging to align consistently. Around her, the range had gone unusually quiet. Even the other recruits who were still shooting seemed to be firing more deliberately, as if they didn't want to disturb whatever magic was happening at position 23. Maria could feel dozens of eyes on her, but she'd learned long ago to use external pressure as fuel rather than distraction. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her first shot from standing position rang out across the range, and Maria knew immediately that it wasn't perfect. The rifle's recoil felt different without the solid bone support of prone or kneeling positions, and the wobbly stock had thrown off her follow-through slightly. But when the target came up marked, it showed a 4. Still an excellent shot, just outside the bullseye ring. Staff Sergeant Thompson stepped closer, and Maria could sense his renewed confidence. One imperfect shot had given him hope that his plan might still work, that the girl from East LA would finally crack under the pressure he'd created. "Consistency is key, Rodriguez," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by nearby recruits. "Any shooter can get lucky once or twice, but it takes real skill to perform when it matters most." Maria's second standing shot was another 4-pointer, still excellent by any reasonable standard, but not the perfection she'd maintained through the first 3 stages. She could hear whispers starting among the observers, speculation about whether she was finally feeling the pressure or if the damaged weapon was finally showing its limitations. But Maria knew something the spectators didn't. She was learning. Each shot with the broken rifle was teaching her more about its peculiarities, its unique rhythm and requirements. The weapon that Thompson had intended as sabotage was becoming her partner, and she was adapting to its needs with each trigger pull. Her third shot from standing position, bullseye. The whispers stopped. Fourth shot, bullseye. Fifth shot, bullseye. By her 7th shot from the standing position, Maria had found her groove with the damaged rifle. She'd learned to anticipate the stock's looseness, to compensate for the bent sight, to work with the heavy trigger pull instead of fighting against it. Each shot was a conversation between shooter and weapon, and Maria was becoming fluent in this particular rifle's language. The 8th, 9th, and 10th shots all found the bullseye, punctuating what was becoming clear to everyone on the range. They were witnessing something extraordinary. Maria Rodriguez, shooting with a weapon that should have been retired years ago, had just fired a perfect score on the Army's standard marksmanship qualification. 40 out of 40 points. Expert marksman. Perfect score. The range went silent except for the distant sound of brass casings settling on the ground. Even the range officers seemed unsure what to do next. Perfect scores were rare enough with pristine equipment, but with a rifle held together by electrical tape and determination, it was virtually unheard of. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered the range master, a grizzled warrant officer who'd been running qualification courses for over 20 years. "In all my time on this range, I've never seen anything like that." But Thompson wasn't finished. As the other recruits began securing their weapons and preparing to clear the range, he approached Maria with the expression of a man who just watched his carefully laid plans crumble into dust. "Outstanding shooting, Rodriguez," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "But qualification is just the beginning. Anyone can perform under controlled conditions with unlimited time. Let's see how you handle some real pressure." Maria sensed that this wasn't over. Thompson's ego couldn't accept that his attempt at sabotage had backfired so completely. He needed to find another way to prove his point, another test that would finally expose what he saw as the fundamental weakness of women in combat roles. "What did you have in mind, Drill Sergeant?" Maria asked, her voice calm and respectful despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. Thompson's smile returned, but it was the cold expression of a predator who'd spotted new prey. "Range records, Rodriguez. This installation has standing records for various courses of fire. Since you seem to think you're hot stuff with that broken rifle, let's see how you stack up against the best shooters who've ever set foot on this range." The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down in a medieval duel. Maria understood the implications immediately. Thompson was offering her a chance to attempt official range records, achievements that would be documented and remembered long after basic training ended. But he was also setting her up for what he hoped would be a spectacular failure that would put her back in what he considered her proper place. Around them, the other recruits had stopped their post-qualification activities to listen. Word was spreading quickly through the group that something unprecedented was happening, that their classmate with the broken rifle was about to attempt something that could make military history or provide Thompson with the humiliation he'd been seeking all along.
The atmosphere on the range shifted from routine qualification to something approaching a sporting event. News of Maria's perfect score with the damaged rifle had spread beyond the immediate group of recruits, and personnel from around the base were beginning to arrive to witness what might happen next. Major Patricia Hayes, the base marksmanship coordinator, appeared seemingly out of nowhere. A compact woman in her 40s, with steel-gray eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, Major Hayes had heard about the situation over the radio and come to investigate personally. She examined the rifle that had caused such a stir, her expression growing more incredulous with each detail she noticed. "Sergeant Thompson," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that comes with 20 years of military service, "what exactly is this weapon doing on my range?" Thompson straightened to attention. "Ma'am, it's a standard M16A1 from our training inventory. All weapons were inspected and approved for—" "Don't," Major Hayes interrupted, holding up a hand. "This weapon should have been turned in for depot maintenance months ago. The front sight is damaged, the stock is loose, and I can see corrosion in the chamber from here." She turned to Maria. "And you shot a perfect qualification with this?" "Yes, ma'am," Maria replied. Major Hayes studied the young recruit for a long moment. She'd been in the Army since 1967, when women weren't even allowed in most military occupational specialties. She'd fought battles for recognition and respect that made Thompson's sabotage attempt look amateur by comparison. She recognized something in Maria's bearing that reminded her of her younger self, a quiet determination that couldn't be broken by inferior equipment or hostile attitudes. "Sergeant Thompson has suggested that you attempt some range records. Are you interested in that opportunity?" The way she phrased it made clear this was Maria's choice, not Thompson's challenge. The politics of the situation had shifted, and suddenly, Thompson looked less like a drill sergeant testing a recruit and more like a bully who'd been caught in the act. "Yes, ma'am," Maria said. "I'd like to try." Major Hayes nodded and turned to Thompson. "Then we'll do this properly. If Private Rodriguez is going to attempt range records, she'll need proper equipment and official scoring." Thompson's face reddened. "Ma'am, the point was to see if she could perform with—" "The point, Sergeant, is to see what kind of soldier we're training, and sabotaging her equipment serves no one." She looked at Marie again. "However, if you'd rather stick with that rifle, you're welcome to. It would certainly make any records you set more memorable." The choice was Maria's, and everyone on the range knew it. She could accept a pristine rifle and attempt the records on equal footing with every shooter who'd come before, or
She could stick with the broken weapon that had become her unlikely partner and make a statement that would echo through Fort Leonard Wood for years to come. Maria looked at the damaged rifle in her hands. The electrical tape was starting to peel where her grip had worn against it. The stock still wobbled when she shouldered it. The front sight was still bent, the trigger still heavy and rough. By any reasonable standard, it was an obstacle to accurate shooting. But it was also the rifle that had carried her to a perfect qualification score. It was the weapon that had turned Thompson's attempt at humiliation into a demonstration of skill and determination. Most importantly, it was proof that excellence didn't depend on perfect conditions. Sometimes it meant making the best of what you had. "I'll keep this one, ma'am," Maria said, patting the worn receiver. "We've got an understanding now." A ripple of amazement went through the crowd of observers. Even Major Hayes looked surprised by the decision, though there was approval in her expression as well. "Very well," she said. "Which records would you like to attempt?" Thompson stepped forward, his confidence returning now that Maria realized she was sticking with the damaged weapon. "All of them," he said. "If Private Rodriguez thinks she's ready for anything the Army can throw at her, let's see her put up or shut up." It was a vindictive challenge, designed to ensure failure through sheer volume. Fort Leonard Wood had 4 standing range records: fastest qualification time, highest score in a stress shoot, best performance in low-light conditions, and, the most challenging of all, a precision course that required hitting targets at distances up to 500 meters. Major Hayes raised an eyebrow. "That's quite ambitious, Sergeant. Most shooters focus on one record at a time." "I'm game if Private Rodriguez is," Thompson replied, his smile returning as he sensed victory. 4 different courses meant 4 different opportunities for the broken rifle to fail, 4 different chances for Maria crack under pressure. Maria felt the weight of expectation from the growing crowd of observers. She thought about her neighborhood back home, where failure was always expected and success was treated as a temporary accident. She thought about her father, working 2 jobs to support his family, never complaining about the unfairness of his situation. She thought about her mother, cleaning houses for families that barely acknowledged her existence, maintaining her dignity through every slight. Most of all, she thought about what she'd learned during her perfect qualification. That equipment didn't determine capability, that obstacles could become advantages, and that sometimes the best way to silence critics was to exceed every expectation they set. "Let's do it," Maria said. The crowd stirred with excitement and disbelief. Word was spreading throughout the base that a female recruit with a broken rifle was about to attempt all 4 range records in a single afternoon. Personnel who had no business being on a firing range suddenly found reasons to walk by and observe.
Major Hayes took charge of the situation with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades managing complicated training scenarios. She dispatched personnel to set up the various courses, called the range tower to coordinate with other training activities, and most importantly, summoned the official scoring team that would validate any records that might fall. "This is highly irregular," she announced to the growing crowd, "but if we're going to do it, we're going to do it right. Any record set today will be official and properly documented." The first challenge Thompson had selected was the speed qualification, completing the standard marksmanship test in the shortest possible time. The existing record stood at 12 minutes and 34 seconds, set by a Special Forces soldier 3 years earlier. Most recruits took 45 minutes to an hour to complete the same course. Maria studied the course layout while the targets were being reset. Speed shooting required a different mindset than precision shooting. Instead of taking unlimited time to ensure perfect shot placement, she would need to balance accuracy with urgency, making quick decisions and trusting her muscle memory. The broken rifle would actually be a disadvantage here. The loose stock and damaged sights required compensation techniques that took precious seconds to execute. But Maria had spent the morning learning the weapon's personality, and she was confident she could work with its limitations even under time pressure. "Shooter, ready?" called the range officer. "Ready," Maria replied, settling into her first firing position. "Your time starts now." Maria moved through the course like a dancer who'd rehearsed the choreography thousands of times. Prone, supported at 300 meters, sight picture, breath control, squeeze, observe impact, adjust, continue. 10 shots in rapid succession, each one requiring the same mental compensation for the rifle's defects, each one landing in the scoring rings. She transitioned to prone, unsupported, without wasting motion, her body flowing from one position to the next with practiced efficiency. The 200-meter target seemed larger after the 300-meter shots, but she maintained the same deliberate pace, refusing to rush despite the ticking clock. 7 minutes elapsed, called the timekeeper. The kneeling position at 100 meters was where speed shooters often lost time, struggling with the less stable platform while trying to maintain accuracy. Maria dropped into her kneeling position and immediately found her natural point of aim, the hours of practice paying dividends as her body automatically assumed the correct alignment. Her shots came in a steady rhythm. Aim, breathe, squeeze, recover. Aim, breathe, squeeze, recover. The broken rifle's heavy trigger actually helped in rapid fire, preventing her from rushing her shots and jerking the trigger under time pressure. 10 minutes! Standing position! The final stage required 10 shots from 50 meters in the standing position, theoretically the easiest distance, but standing unsupported was always unpredictable. Maria assumed her stance and began firing with mechanical precision, treating each shot as if time wasn't a factor while moving with controlled urgency between engagements. Her final shot broke at 11 minutes and 47 seconds, 47 seconds faster than the previous record, accomplished with a rifle that should have been retired from service. The crowd erupted in applause and amazement. Even Thompson looked stunned by the performance, though he quickly recovered his composure. "Lucky wind conditions," he muttered, echoing his earlier comment. "Let's see how she does with the stress shoot." The stress shoot was designed to simulate combat conditions by adding physical and mental pressure to the shooting equation. Participants had to complete a series of physical exercises, push-ups, sprints, obstacle negotiation, between shooting stages with their heart rate elevated and fine motor skills degraded by fatigue. "This is where reality sets in," Thompson announced to the crowd. "When your heart's pounding and your hands are shaking, that's when equipment matters. That's when broken gear will let you down." Maria knew she was probably right. The stress shoot record was 38 out of 40 points set by a ranger instructor who'd completed the course with a perfect rifle under perfect conditions. Maintaining accuracy with a damaged weapon while physically exhausted would be exponentially more difficult. But she'd learned something important during her morning of shooting. The broken rifle's limitations were predictable and consistent. The bent sight always required the same compensation, the loose stock always wobbled in the same pattern, the heavy trigger always required the same additional pressure. These weren't random variables, they were simply characteristics to account for. The stress shoot began with a 400-meter sprint in full gear, followed immediately by 50 push-ups, then transitioned to the first firing position. Maria's conditioning from basic training served her well. She had been running and doing push-ups for 2 months, and her body was adapted to performing under physical stress. Her first shots came as her heart rate was still elevated from the sprint and push-ups. She could feel the pulse in her temples, the slight tremor in her hands from exertion. But she applied the same compensation techniques she'd developed during qualification, accounting for both the rifle's defects and her body's physiological state.
The stress shoot continued with a relentless pace designed to break down even experienced marksmen. After each series of shots, Maria had to complete another physical challenge. Low crawls under barbed wire, rope climbs, tire flips, and bear crawls that left her muscles burning and her breathing labored. But something remarkable was happening. Instead of degrading under the physical stress, Maria's shooting seemed to improve. The broken rifle that had been a handicap in precision shooting was becoming an advantage in stress conditions. The heavy trigger that required extra pressure actually prevented her from jerking shots when her fine motor skills were compromised by fatigue. The loose stock forced her to maintain a more consistent grip, and the bent sight made her focus more intently on sight alignment despite her elevated heart rate. 36 points in climbing, announced the official scorer after Maria's third series of shots. She was already matching the existing record with 2 stages remaining. Staff Sergeant Thompson's confidence was visibly wavering. He'd expected the physical stress to expose Maria's limitations, to prove that her earlier performance was just beginner's luck enhanced by ideal conditions. Instead, she was demonstrating that her marksmanship skills were fundamentally sound, capable of adapting to any challenge. Major Hayes watched from the sideline with the expression of someone witnessing history in the making. She'd seen thousands of soldiers attempt the stress shoot over her career, and she recognized that Maria's performance was transcending human limitations. This wasn't just about marksmanship anymore. It was about mental toughness, adaptability, and the kind of warrior spirit that couldn't be taught in any manual. The fourth stage required Maria to negotiate an obstacle course while carrying the rifle and a full combat load, then immediately transition to shooting from improvised positions, standing behind barriers, prone on uneven ground, kneeling on rocky surfaces that made stability nearly impossible. Maria's breathing was heavy, but controlled, as she completed the obstacle course. Sweat stung her eyes and her uniform was soaked through, but her mind remained clear and focused. She'd learned to compartmentalize during her childhood in East LA, to maintain concentration despite chaos and discomfort. The physical stress of the course was just another variable to manage. Her shots from the improvised positions continued to find their marks. The broken rifle had become an extension of herself, its quirks and limitations as familiar as her own heartbeat. When she needed to compensate for the bent sight, her hands moved automatically. When the loose stock threatened to shift her point of aim, her muscles adjusted without conscious thought. 38 points, called the scorer. 1 more series to go. Maria had already tied the stress shoot record, and she still had 10 shots remaining. The final stage was traditionally the most difficult, shooting while wearing a gas mask that restricted vision and breathing, simulating chemical warfare conditions that degraded every aspect of human performance. The protective mask made everything worse. Maria's field of vision was reduced to narrow slits, her breathing was labored through the filter system, and condensation from her exertion was starting to fog the lenses. The rifle felt alien in her hands when she couldn't see it clearly, and the familiar sight picture she developed over the morning was distorted by the mask's optical limitations. But Maria had one advantage that Thompson hadn't counted on. She'd learned to shoot by feel as much as by sight. The broken rifle's unique characteristics, the way the stock felt against her shoulder, the particular resistance of the heavy trigger, the sound and vibration of each shot, had become reference points that didn't depend on perfect vision. Her first shot with the gas mask hit the outer ring of the target. Not perfect, but still a scoring shot. The second shot was better, closer to center. By her fifth shot, she'd adapted to the mask's limitations and was consistently hitting the bullseye, despite the restricted vision and labored breathing. "Perfect score!" shouted the official scorer as Maria's final shot struck home. 40 out of 40 points! New range record! The crowd erupted in celebration, but Thompson wasn't finished. His face was red with frustration and something approaching desperation. 2 records had fallen, and his plan to humiliate Maria was backfiring spectacularly. "Night shoot," he called out, his voice cutting through the celebration. "Let's see how she does when she can't see what she's shooting at." The night shoot was the third record Maria would attempt, and it was arguably the most challenging. Conducted in low-light conditions that simulated dawn or dusk combat scenarios, it required shooters to engage targets that were barely visible, relying on artificial illumination and enhanced shooting techniques. Major Hayes checked her watch. "It's 1,500 hours, Sergeant. We'll need to wait for natural darkness, or we can simulate night conditions with artificial darkness. Full simulation. If she's as good as everyone thinks, lighting shouldn't matter."
The range crew began setting up the night shoot course while Maria took a brief break to hydrate and check her equipment. The broken rifle showed new signs of wear from the afternoon's intensive use. The electrical tape was completely loose now, hanging in strips from the handguards. The wobbly stock had gotten worse, and she could feel grit in the action from the dust kicked up during the obstacle course. Any reasonable person would have requested a replacement weapon. The rifle had served its purpose, proving that Maria could excel despite inferior equipment. There was no shame in acknowledging that the weapon had reached the limits of its usability. But Maria looked at the battered rifle and saw something different than damaged equipment. She saw a partner that had carried her through 2 record-breaking performances, a weapon that had adapted to her style as much as she'd adapted to its limitations. The electrical tape might be loose, but her grip had worn smooth spots exactly where her hands naturally fell. The wobbly stock might be loose, but she'd learned to use that looseness to fine-tune her sight picture. "Ready for the night shoot, Rodriguez?" Thompson asked, hope creeping back into his voice as he noticed the rifle's deteriorating condition. "Ready, Drill Sergeant," Maria replied, chambering around in the increasingly unreliable weapon.
The artificial night shoot conditions were more challenging than anything Maria had faced so far. Powerful lights created harsh shadows and glare that confused depth perception, while the targets themselves were barely visible silhouettes against a darkened background. The course required engaging targets at various distances while moving between positions, simulating the chaos and confusion of nighttime combat operations. The existing record for the night shoot was 34 out of 40 points, set by a Special Forces sniper who'd used night vision equipment and a precision rifle system worth more than most people's cars. Maria would be attempting the course with iron sights and a rifle that was literally falling apart in her hands. "Shooter ready?" called the range officer. Maria settled into the first firing position, squinting through the damaged rifle's sights at targets she could barely make out in the artificial twilight. The bent front sight post was even more problematic in low light conditions, creating optical illusions that made precise aiming nearly impossible. But impossibility was a concept that Maria had been defying all afternoon. Her first shot in the low light conditions was guided more by instinct than sight. She'd memorized the feel of the rifle's natural point of aim, the way her body aligned when everything was properly positioned. The heavy trigger that had been a liability in precision shooting became an asset in conditions where she couldn't see the sight picture clearly. It forced her to follow through completely on every shot. The targets were marked and scored in real time, with spotlights briefly illuminating each one to show shot placement. Maria's first target showed a solid hit in the scoring ring. Not perfect, but well within the standards for expert marksmanship. As she moved through the course, something extraordinary began to happen. The broken rifle's limitations, which should have been magnified by the poor lighting conditions, seemed to matter less and less. Maria was shooting by feel now, trusting muscle memory and instinct developed over hundreds of rounds fired that afternoon. Her second target? Bullseye. Third target? Bullseye. By the halfway point of the night shoot, Maria had already matched the existing record with half the course remaining. The crowd of observers had grown throughout the afternoon and now included personnel from across the base who'd heard about the remarkable performance taking place on their firing range. Colonel Richard Morrison, the base commander, had arrived during the stress shoot and was watching with the expression of someone witnessing something that would be talked about for decades. A 30-year veteran who'd seen combat in Vietnam and countless training exercises, he recognized that Maria's performance transcended normal military achievement. This was the kind of story that became legend. "Sergeant Thompson," Colonel Morrison said quietly, "what exactly is the condition of that rifle Private Rodriguez is using?" Thompson straightened to attention, suddenly aware that his afternoon of harassment had attracted the attention of the base's senior leadership. "Sir, it's a standard M16A1 from our training inventory." "That's not what I asked, Sergeant." Major Hayes stepped forward before Thompson could respond. "Sir, the weapon should have been turned in for depot maintenance months ago. It's held together with electrical tape and has multiple defects that should have rendered it unserviceable."
Colonel Morrison studied the rifle through his binoculars as Maria prepared for her next series of shots. Even from a distance, he could see the obvious signs of damage and wear. "And Maria requested this weapon?" "No, sir," Major Hayes replied. "It was assigned to her by Sergeant Thompson for qualification this morning." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a misfired round. Colonel Morrison's expression didn't change, but Thompson suddenly looked like a man who wished he could disappear into the range floor. Maria continued shooting, unaware of the command-level discussion taking place behind her. The night shoot course was reaching its most challenging phase. Moving targets that required leading the shot, partially obscured targets that demanded precise hold-off techniques, and time-limited exposures that tested reaction speed as much as accuracy. The broken rifle's loose stock was actually helping with the moving targets. The slight play in the system allowed Maria to track smoothly without the rigid lockup that sometimes caused shooters to fall behind fast-moving targets. The heavy trigger prevented her from jerking shots when targets appeared suddenly, forcing her to maintain proper shooting fundamentals even under time pressure. Target after target fell to her fire. The artificial lighting that should have been disorienting became just another variable to account for. The rifle that should have been sabotaging her performance had become her ally. Its familiar quirks provided reference points in the confusing low-light environment. "New record," announced the scorer as Maria's final shot found its mark. 37 out of 40 points. 3 records in one afternoon, with a rifle held together with electrical tape and determination. By a 19-year-old recruit from East Los Angeles who'd never held a military weapon before basic training began. But Thompson wasn't finished. His face was pale now, his confidence completely shattered, but his pride demanded one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his plan. "Precision course," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. 500 meters, that's where equipment really matters. That's where all the luck in the world won't help. The precision course was Fort Lewin Wood's ultimate marksmanship challenge. Targets at 500 meters were barely visible to the naked eye, requiring perfect technique, perfect equipment, and perfect conditions to hit consistently. The existing record was held by the Army Marksmanship Unit's national champion, achieved with a custom-built rifle that cost more than Maria's family made in a year. Attempting the precision course with her broken rifle wasn't just ambitious, it was borderline impossible. But impossible was a word that Maria had lost all meaning for Maria Rodriguez.
The precision course at 500 meters was set up like a sniper's ultimate test. 5 targets, each no larger than a dinner plate, positioned at the maximum effective range of the M16 rifle system. The existing record required hitting at least 4 of the 5 targets, a feat that demanded not just exceptional marksmanship skills, but equipment capable of sub-minute of angle accuracy. Maria's rifle, even when it was new, wouldn't have been considered precision equipment. The M16A1 was designed as a battle rifle, built for reliability and ease of manufacture rather than target-grade accuracy. In its current condition, held together by electrical tape with a bent front sight and loose stock, attempting precision shooting at 500 meters was like trying to perform surgery with a butter knife. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, creating variable lighting conditions that added another layer of difficulty to the challenge. Shadows were lengthening across the range and the wind had picked up, factors that would affect bullet trajectory at the extreme distance. Colonel Morrison positioned himself at the spotting scope to personally observe the attempt. Word had spread throughout the base about the day's events, and the crowd of observers now included personnel from every unit on post. This wasn't just about one recruit's performance anymore. It was about redefining what was possible with inferior equipment and superior determination. "Private Rodriguez," Colonel Morrison called out, "you've already accomplished something remarkable today. No one would think less of you if you chose to end on your current success." It was an offer of graceful exit, a chance to preserve the legend she'd already created without risking failure on an almost impossible challenge. But Maria looked at the target's 500 meters downrange, barely visible specks against the darkening landscape, and thought about every time someone had told her something was impossible. Growing up in East LA, she'd been told that kids from her neighborhood didn't go to college, they didn't join the military, they didn't succeed outside the barrio. Her guidance counselor had suggested she focus on realistic goals, like cosmetology or retail work. Her neighbors had warned that the military would chew her up and spit her out. Every expert opinion had been wrong. "I'd like to try, sir," Maria said. She settled into the prone position behind her battered rifle, using sandbags to create the most stable platform possible. At 500 meters, even the smallest movement would be magnified into a complete miss. The loose stock that had been manageable at shorter distances was now a significant liability. Any shift in the rifle's position would throw off her point of aim by inches. The wind was gusting from left to right at an estimated 8 to 10 miles per hour. At 500 meters, that wind would push her bullets several inches off target. She needed to aim left of center and hope that her timing coincided with a consistent wind speed. But the biggest challenge was simply seeing the target. The bent front sight post that she'd learned to compensate for at shorter distances was creating an optical illusion at 500 meters. The target appeared to be in two places at once, where it actually was and where the damaged sight made it appear to be. Maria closed her eyes and visualized the shot. She'd fired nearly 200 rounds that afternoon, each one teaching her more about the rifle's personality. She knew exactly how much pressure the heavy trigger required, exactly how the loose stock would shift when she fired, exactly how much to compensate for the bent sight. Her breathing slowed to the deep, controlled pattern she'd learned during marksmanship training. In for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, out for 4 counts. Natural respiratory pause, fire. The shot broke cleanly, the rifle's recoil driving straight back into her shoulder. Through the spotting scope, Colonel Morrison watched the bullet's trace as it arced toward the distant target. "Hit!" called the spotter. "Center mass!" A cheer went up from the crowd, but Maria was already preparing for her second shot. 1 hit out of 5 wasn't a record, it was just a good start. She needed 4 hits to tie the existing record, 5 hits to set a new one. The second shot required her to adjust for a slight change in wind direction. The gusts were becoming more variable as the sun set, creating constantly changing conditions that would challenge even the most experienced marksman. Maria watched the grass between her position and the target, reading the wind patterns like a book written in swaying vegetation. Her second shot, hit. Third shot, hit. The crowd was getting louder with each successful hit, but Maria shut out the noise and focused on the mechanical process of loading, aiming, and firing. The broken rifle had become an extension of her will, its limitations transformed into predictable variables that she could account for and overcome. Fourth shot, hit. 4 hits out of 4 shots. She'd already tied the precision record held by the Army's national champion. 1 more hit would set a new record with equipment that shouldn't have been capable of hitting a barn at 500 meters. The final and 5th target seemed impossibly small through the damaged sights. The wind had shifted again and the light was fading fast. Every factor was working against her, and the rifle was showing new signs of wear from the afternoon's intensive use. Maria chambered her final round and settled behind the rifle one last time. The electrical tape had finally given up completely, hanging in tatters from the handguards. The stock was wobbling more than ever, and she could feel looseness in the barrel extension that hadn't been there that morning. But the rifle had carried her this far. It had been her partner through 4 record-breaking performances, adapting to her needs as much as she'd adapted to its limitations. Whatever happened with this final shot, they'd made the journey together.
The range fell completely silent as Maria prepared for her final shot.
Even the wind seemed to pause, as if nature itself was holding its breath for what might be the most remarkable marksmanship demonstration in Fort Leonard Wood's history. 500 meters downrange, the target waited, a small silhouette that represented the difference between tying a record and setting one that might never be broken. Maria's breathing was controlled and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The broken rifle felt heavier now, its various defects more pronounced after firing nearly 250 rounds in a single afternoon. She settled into her final shooting position with the deliberate precision of a surgeon preparing for a critical operation. The sandbags were positioned to provide maximum stability, her body aligned to create the strongest possible shooting platform. The loose stock required her to grip the rifle differently than she'd been taught, compensating for its instability with muscle tension and perfect body position. Through the damaged sights, the target appeared and disappeared with each slight movement of the rifle. The bent front sight post created a double image that would have been disorienting to any shooter who hadn't spent the afternoon learning to work with its peculiarities. But Maria had fired enough rounds to understand the rifle's optical distortion, to know exactly where to aim to compensate for the sight's defects. The wind had picked up again, gusting unpredictably across the 500-meter range. At that distance, even the slight breeze could push a bullet several inches off target. Maria watched the grass and vegetation between her position and the target, reading the wind patterns with the intuition of someone who'd spent her childhood observing her environment for signs of danger or opportunity. Staff Sergeant Thompson stood behind her, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. His plan to humiliate Maria had evolved into something he could never have anticipated, a demonstration of skill and determination that was humbling everyone who witnessed it. The recruit he'd tried to break was instead breaking records with equipment he'd sabotaged, turning his attempt at undermining her into the foundation of her legend. Colonel Morrison maintained his position at the spotting scope, documenting what might be the most extraordinary marksmanship performance in military history. As a veteran of multiple combat deployments, he understood that what he was witnessing transcended normal human performance. This was the kind of warrior spirit that couldn't be taught, only recognized and nurtured. Major Hayes stood with the growing crowd of observers, her own memories of fighting for recognition and respect in a male-dominated military making her appreciate the significance of Maria's achievement on multiple levels. This wasn't just about marksmanship. It was about proving that excellence could overcome any obstacle, that determination could triumph over sabotage. Maria's final sight picture came together like the last piece of a complex puzzle. The wind steadied for a moment, the target centered itself in her damaged sights, and her trigger finger found the precise pressure point she'd learned through hundreds of repetitions. The heavy trigger that had been a liability in speed shooting became an asset in precision work, forcing her to follow through completely on the shot. The rifle fired with the familiar crack and recoil she had experienced throughout the afternoon. The bullet traced its arc across the 500-meter range, carrying with it the hopes and expectations of everyone watching. For what seemed like an eternity, the projectile flew through the gathering dusk toward its distant target. "Hit!" shouted the spotter. "Dead center!" The crowd erupted in cheers that could be heard across the entire base. Personnel who had no connection to the range or the training exercise found themselves applauding a performance they didn't fully understand, but instinctively recognized as extraordinary. 5 hits out of 5 shots at 500 meters, a perfect score on the precision course, a new range record set with a rifle that should have been retired from service months earlier. Maria saved her weapon and stood up from the firing position, her legs slightly unsteady after hours of intensive shooting. The broken rifle felt different in her hands now, not like sabotaged equipment, but like a trusted partner that had carried her through an impossible challenge. Colonel Morrison approached with the expression of someone who just witnessed history.
Private Rodriguez, you've set 4 new range records in a single afternoon. That's an achievement that will be remembered long after we're all gone." Staff Sergeant Thompson stepped forward, his face showing a mixture of shame and grudging respect. The recruit he'd tried to humiliate had instead taught him a lesson about the danger of underestimating people based on preconceptions. "Outstanding performance, Rodriguez. I misjudged you." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was acknowledgement, recognition that his attempt at sabotage had revealed something remarkable about both Maria's character and his own prejudices. As the crowd began to disperse and the range crew started securing equipment for the night, Maria looked at the battered rifle one final time. The electrical tape hung in ribbons, the stock wobbled dramatically, and the front sight was still bent at an impossible angle. By any objective measure, it was a piece of junk that belonged to the maintenance depot, not on a firing range. But it had also been her partner in achieving something that would be talked about for decades. Together, they had turned an attempt at humiliation into a demonstration of what was possible when skill met determination, when obstacles became opportunities, and when someone refused to accept that broken equipment meant broken dreams. The rifle would be retired after that day, preserved as a testament to an afternoon when impossible became inevitable. And Maria Rodriguez, the girl from East Los Angeles who'd never held a military weapon before basic training, would go on to a distinguished military career. But she would never forget the lesson she learned with a broken M16 on a Missouri firing range. Sometimes, the most remarkable achievements come not from perfect conditions, but from refusing to let imperfect conditions define your limits.
The aftermath of Maria's record-breaking performance rippled through Fort Leonard Wood like stones thrown into still water. By evening chow, every soldier on base had heard some version of the story. The female recruit who'd set 4 range records in one afternoon with a rifle held together by electrical tape. But like all military legends, the story grew in the telling, with each retelling adding new details and amplifying the impossibility of what had actually happened. In the days that followed, Maria found herself something of a celebrity within the military training community. Her achievement had been officially documented and forwarded up the chain of command, eventually reaching the Pentagon, where senior officers struggled to understand how such a performance was possible with substandard equipment. The broken rifle was preserved and sent to the Army's Marksmanship Museum, where it would serve as a permanent reminder that human potential could overcome any material limitation. But the real impact of that afternoon went far beyond record books and museum displays. Word of Maria's performance spread throughout the military's informal networks, reaching female soldiers stationed around the world who saw in her achievement a reflection of their own struggles against prejudice and sabotage. Letters began arriving at Fort Leonard Wood from women in uniform who wanted to express their gratitude for what Maria had represented. Proof that excellence was gender-neutral and that artificial barriers could be overcome through skill and determination. Staff Sergeant Thompson's role in the affair became the subject of an official investigation. His attempt to sabotage Maria's qualification had backfired so spectacularly that it drew attention from the Inspector General's office, which was already conducting a broader review of training practices at various installations. Thompson found himself reassigned to a desk job while the investigation proceeded. His career effectively ended by his own prejudices. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. Thompson's attempt to prove that women didn't belong in combat roles had instead created one of the most compelling arguments for female integration in military history. His sabotage had become the foundation for Maria's legend, his bias transformed into evidence of her exceptional capabilities. Maria herself handled the attention with the same quiet dignity she'd shown on the firing range. She completed basic training with honor, graduating at the top of her class and earning selection for military police school, exactly the career field she'd wanted from the beginning. Her qualification scores ensured that she had her choice of assignments, and she selected a posting with the 82nd Airborne Division, one of the Army's most prestigious units. But perhaps the most significant change came in the training protocols at Fort Leonard Wood.
Colonel Morrison ordered a comprehensive review of equipment standards and instructor practices, determined to ensure that no other drill sergeant would be able to sabotage a recruit's training through inferior equipment or deliberate harassment. Maria's experience had exposed systemic problems that went far beyond one biased instructor. New procedures were implemented requiring detailed equipment inspections before qualification shoots. Instructors were retrained on proper evaluation techniques and professional conduct standards. Most importantly, a formal complaint process was established that allowed recruits to report equipment problems or instructor bias without fear of retaliation. The changes rippled throughout the military training system as other installations adopted similar reforms. Maria's afternoon on the firing range had inadvertently triggered a revolution in how the military approached training equality and equipment standards. Her individual achievement had become a catalyst for institutional change that would benefit thousands of future soldiers. Years later, as a sergeant in the military police, Maria would return to Fort Leonard Wood as an instructor herself. She found the range where she'd set her records largely unchanged. The same targets, the same firing positions, the same view across the Missouri landscape. But the culture had transformed completely. Female soldiers were no longer curiosities or targets for harassment. They were simply soldiers evaluated on their performance rather than their gender. The memorial plaque installed near the 500-meter line told the story in simple terms. On this range, Private Maria Rodriguez demonstrated that excellence knows no boundaries. Her achievement with damaged equipment on October 15, 1987, reminds us that human potential is limited only by human imagination. But for Maria, the real lesson of that day wasn't about marksmanship or military records. It was about the power of refusing to accept other people's limitations as your own reality. Staff Sergeant Thompson had tried to define what she could accomplish by giving her broken equipment and expecting her to fail. Instead, she had redefined what was possible by turning his sabotage into her opportunity. The broken rifle had taught her that perfection wasn't about having perfect tools, it was about maximizing whatever tools you had. The electrical tape and wobbly stock hadn't prevented her success, they had simply required her to develop better technique and stronger focus. The bent sight hadn't made accuracy impossible, it had forced her to be more precise in her compensation and more thoughtful in her approach. These lessons served her well throughout her military career and beyond. When she encountered obstacles, and there were many and a profession still adapting to female integration, she approached them as problems to solve rather than excuses for failure. 20 years after that afternoon at Fort Leonard Wood, Sergeant Major Maria Rodriguez would retire from the Army after a distinguished career that included deployments to every major conflict zone of her generation. She would receive numerous decorations for valor and leadership, serve in increasingly responsible positions, and mentor countless young soldiers who never had to face the barriers she had overcome. But when people asked her about her proudest moment in uniform, she would always return to that October afternoon in Missouri when a 19-year-old recruit from East Los Angeles proved that broken equipment couldn't break an unbreakable spirit. That was the day she learned that the most important weapon in any soldier's arsenal wasn't carried in their hands, it was carried in their heart. The lesson of the broken M16 lived on in every soldier who refused to let circumstances define their capabilities, in every person who chose to see obstacles as opportunities, and in every individual who understood that the only real limitations are the ones we accept for ourselves. Sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is to succeed with what others consider insufficient. Sometimes the greatest victory comes not from perfect conditions, but from perfect determination to overcome imperfect ones. And sometimes, when they give you a broken rifle to humiliate you, the best response is to set 4 range records in one afternoon and teach everyone watching what excellence really looks like. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.